Welcome to the Arabesque Sewing Studio and to video 5 of the tutorial series for the Sewing Space Station. Now in this video we'll be making the cargo bay. So I'll be running through how to make the quilted panels, how to attach the elastic loops, and how to add the darts and the lining into this really cute little pouch. So now we're moving on to sewing the cargo bay. So this is the cargo bay here. It's just a little pouch made from quilted panels, and it has an elastic loop on either side of the flap that allows you to hang this from the front tool panel. It has another elastic loop that holds the flap shut. And you need to be aware that this piece, the back and the flap, are cut from one piece. So if you're using a directional fabric, you need to be aware that if you would like your flap closing the right way up, then your back is going to be upside down. So if you don't want that to happen, then you need to choose a different fabric where the direction doesn't matter. You'll need to have a piece for your front and a piece for your back flap, and they will both need to be fused to fleece, and quilted with the pattern that you would like to have on there. You will also need a front lining with interfacing fused to the back, and a back and flap lining with interfacing fused on it as well. So I'm going to meet you back here after I have quilted my panels. Now I'm back with my panels all quilted, so now we're ready to trace the templates onto the front of these. So you'll notice that you've got some triangular sections here, and these are called darts, and this is what's going to add some shape to this cargo bay. So there's a dot at the top of this triangle here. You're just going to poke a little hole in each of them, and then also just grab your paper scissors and just snip just a 1/4 inch at the bottom of each of those arms of that triangle. Okay, so now you're going to position this onto the right side of your quilted panel here, and we're going to trace around that. Now we're going to cut out. Now you're just going to flip this over so that the fleece is facing right side up, and take your template and place it back on here again, get it all nicely aligned. Then we're going to mark the position of these darts by placing the pen inside the dot and also inside each of those little snips that you did at the base of the triangle to mark the arms of the dart. So then you can just grab your ruler and you're going to rule from the dot down to those arms and just transfer that little triangle onto the fabric here. So we'll just set that aside, and then you're going to grab your lining, and we're going to repeat this. Mark those darts on the lining section as well. So just put your pen into that little hole and mark at the bottom of each of these arms. Because we have got bulk in the dart for the quilted section, we'll be trimming these down later. The last thing is to mark the centre front on each of these. So you can either mark that from the pattern, or you can fold this carefully in half and pinch it right on the fold and just give it just a tiny little snip. You have a nice centre front marking there. So take your template for your back and flap. Now I've got a specific way that I want my flap closing, so I would like this to be at the front of the flap. So I'm going to align my centre front over this section here. And I think that should look really good. I'm also going to transfer the markings for the elastic loop here. So just lift that up and mark under there. Then I'll fold this in half in a minute and transfer the centre front markings. So go ahead and cut this out as well. Okay, so go and fold this in half and pinch on that fold, and then you can just snip the very tip there to mark your centre fronts. So now you need to grab both of your little short ends of elastic and fold them in half and line up those two ends. And then we're going to place that over one of these markings that we placed here on the edge, and just clip that in place, and then grab the other one that onto the other marking and clip that in place. And the last longer piece is going to line up at the centre front base. Then you're going to grab your longer piece of elastic and align the ends together on this. Now this is going to go on the centre front base, and you'll notice on your panel here that you've got two halves. One of them is slightly smaller than the other, so the base is the larger half. So we're going to align that to the centre front base here. And just grab one more clip and hold that in place. So now we can take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to baste these pieces of elastic in place. Now you will find that being such narrow elastic, this is quite shifty and it will like to move out of the way of the needle. So I like to actually hand crank my sewing machine wheel so that the needle comes down, and by eye I will guide that needle directly into that very first piece of elastic, the very first side of it, and then using my stiletto I will push my stiletto underneath that other side of the elastic and push that right up against the first one, and then I will hand crank the next stitch into that piece. So that will lock both of them down into the fabric, and then you can go backwards and forwards a couple more times. So I'll demonstrate that at the sewing machine. Now to sew the darts on the front and on the lining, we're going to fold this right sides together and bring those arms of the triangle together. So just look at it from both sides until you can see that those sides of the triangle are meeting. And you're just going to put a clip in that, and we're going to stitch from the bottom up to the top. And just do the same for the lining. Okay, so we're ready to take all of this to the sewing machine. So now you're going to turn your sections so that the darts are facing right sides out, and I'm going to be basting this towards the top. So we're going to be angling this little flap up towards the top on both sides, and if you would like to, you can trim this down a little bit more so that there's even less bulk in there, but it really depends on whether you've quilted this with an extra layer of fabric on the back. That does make this even a little bit more bulky, so when there's just one layer of fleece and fabric, it's actually not too bad. So we're going to lay the front right side out, and then keeping this wrong side out, we're going to place that over the top, aligning this top edge and the center fronts here. And you're just going to clip your way along. Just manipulating all of this so that it comes together. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to baste these lining edges. Actually, I'm going to baste the lining edges down, and I'm going to baste the outer edges upwards so that when these are together, they will actually be nesting and going opposite directions. We're also going to stitch along this clipped edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'll meet you back here. Okay, so now this is stitched across here and these darts are basted down. So we're ready to turn this round to the right side. You can trim down this edge a little bit, and you can also put just a few little snips along here just to help ease all this together. Make sure you're not clipping too deeply or getting too close to your stitching line. So then just grab your iron. We're going to just finger press this to start with. So just scraping this with your nails along the edge of that seam line just to get that nice and crisp, and then turn this back out around together and line up these edges. Edge of that stitching line is right up on the very top edge of that. So you might have to play with it a little bit just to get that all nice and neat. I like to grab a couple of clips here just to hold these layers together where you want them. Give it a press. And now we can take this to the machine and top stitch across this edge at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So now this edge is top stitched, and I forgot to mention that we also need to baste across the bottom edge here, so the lining and the exterior are now joined together as one piece. So you're going to take your back and flap and lay it right side up, and make sure that this larger loop of elastic is at the bottom. We're going to take this front section and lay it right sides together over the top of this. And the first thing we're going to align here is the centre front on the front with the centre front of the back. So you just place a clip over that.
Now we're going to come around to the edge here, and we're going to align this with this edge, and we want this top edge here on the front to be finishing about 1/4 inch below the level of this elastic. So then you're just going to be smooshing that dart down, just squash it, and going to get all these edges to align around the curve. Go back around to the other side. I'm going to align this top edge about 1/4 inch below the elastic here. And we're going to go back around and clip these edges together. So now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch along this curved edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so the very last piece that we need to sew to our cargo bay is the lining. So if you haven't already gone ahead and marked the centre fronts on these on the lining, just go ahead and do that. So just fold and pinch, and then just snip off the tiniest little corner so that you've got a little V there to mark the centre front. So we want to be placing the smaller half here onto the top of the cargo bay. So just to mark that with a clip there, and then take the bottom larger section and align that with the centre front of the base down where the elastic is, and clip that there. And then we're just going to be working our way around. So you're smushing everything out of the way, pushing it down flat inside of there, and aligning all of those layers. We're just going to leave about a 2.5 inch gap opening on the top here for turning this through again at the end. So you're going to sew your way around the edge here at 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving this section open, and then we will turn the whole pouch through that little opening. Okay, so now we've got this stitched down. Now, depending on how many layers you've got here, you may like to trim down some of the extra bulk that you've got here. And if you like, you can also just snip into the curves a little bit of the cargo bay here. Okay, so now we're going to carefully turn this out through the opening that we've left. So just be careful not to go too hard on that opening because you can rip the stitching. Now that you've got this right side out, you're just going to reach your fingers down inside the lining and just help push that seam line out nice and firmly. Make sure that this elastic is sticking out where it should be, and also that this top curve is nicely rounded. So just manipulate that, roll that with your fingers, And I like to scrape my finger along that seam line, and that just really helps get that curve nice and even. So now I'm going to just give this a quick press just along this bottom edge. Just be a little bit careful of the elastic here, because sometimes the heat can be a little bit much for it and can melt it, so just be aware not to blast it with too much. So now I'm just going to tuck these little extra bits from this seam opening inside, and just do my best to get that nice and straight. So you can just press that, and I like to just spend some time getting that nice and smooth, and do some glue basting to help hold this all together, or you can just clip it with a few clips. I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to top stitch just along this flap section just to lock everything together and to stitch over that opening. So all that's left is to sew on the button on the front. So just fold that in half again and mark that centre front marking there, and that's going to be where we stitch our button to. So just grab your needle and your thread and thread your needle. You're going to want to double loop your thread here, join up your ends, tie your knot. So I just wrap my thread around several times, give it a little tug down there, and pull that through, and you'll have a nice fat knot at the bottom there. If you'd like to see another video on that, you can have a look on my channel and see a slow version of tying that knot. So just grab your pouch. Now we're going to come in through the lining side, and I'm going to bury that knot inside the fabric. So I've got my centre front marked here. I'm just going to come up just around where my top stitching line is and bring that needle up through the top layer, and then pull that, and then I'm going to give this a pretty good tug. You can hear that knot snap in between those layers, and that will be nice and secure, and then you won't be able to see it from the front. So then just grab your button. We're going to come up from underneath the button and back down through the top of it. Just flip your pouch over here. Where you don't want to twist it, so I'm just going to turn this around, make sure that I haven't got this twisted. So I want to be able to come out through the top, through that first hole, through the second hole, and then I'm going to pick up just probably about 1/8 of an inch of fabric here, and this distance that I'm picking up is going to be the same distance as the holes are apart on the button itself. So this might vary a little bit just depending on the size of the button you've got. And then you want to pull that so that the button is fairly flush, but you're not wanting to pull it really tight. So come back up through that hole, back down again. Now I'm just coming down through the hole, I'm not going through the fabric right now. I'm going to peel that back, and I'm going to pick up the same amount of fabric so going through just the top layers here, not having any stitching showing on the lining here. And then come up again through the hole, come down again through the hole, pick up another piece of fabric, just a little bit, through those top layers, back up through the top. I'm going to do this one more time. So pick up another piece of fabric, up through the holes, down through the hole, and then I'm going to form a shank around this bottom. So you can see that this is quite nice and wobbly already, but just to stop that wobbling around and just to firm this all up, because I don't want this loose, but I do want it to have a little bit of space. So I'm just going to take the threads and wrap them around the base of that button and around that stitching that I've already done. And I didn't really count that, but I think that's probably about 7 or 8 times. And you can see here that that's formed quite a nice little base around the button here. That's just going to give that a little bit of extra space so that the loop is going to lock very nicely inside of that and come right at the base of that button. So now I'm going to thread my needle back in just at the base of all those stitching and bring it back out through the lining here. Make sure that there's no loops of thread sticking out in a messy sort of way. Then I'm going to tie a knot, a couple of knots against that fabric. And then I'm going to go in and thread back in just through those layers, so make sure that you're not coming out on the top here, and just bury that knot. Come out again a little bit on the side, and then give that a tug. Whoops, broke my thread. Anyway, you get the idea. It's pretty well buried, and then you can just test out your loop and loop that over that button, and that's going to sit really nicely. And of course you can put whatever you like in your cargo bag. It looks really good with thread in it. So just loop that elastic over, and there we have a really cute little pouch that's ready to hang on the front of your space station.